Good morning and Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shalom.
All right, and Shabbat Shalom to those who are watching this video on YouTube. Friendly reminder, please, if you don't have Rumble on your phone or on your laptop, by all means, go to Rumble, get that app, subscribe to Rumble, and this very message that we're going to upload to YouTube will also be uploaded to Rumble. And when you don't see, not if, when you don't see someday Besar Shalom on YouTube, it will be on Rumble. So get in the habit of going to Rumble to see our messages and lessons. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That is just part of the Declaration. Imagine that was penned in a world that embraced, trafficked, and supported slavery. And these men got together and said, not so fast. All men are created equal. The British Crown may not think so, but we do. And we're going to put this land on a trajectory where all men are created equal. We already know it. Will they be treated equally? Why is that? Well, it tells you in the Declaration, because God created us in his own image. And thus the American experiment was to begin. One people, many different backgrounds, coming together in one nation under God, with a common purpose and a common goal, to lift up the God of the Bible, the only Word of God. We're going to lift up that God and celebrate him. And in the process, maybe even make America the greatest nation on the planet. And for nearly 200 years, that's what it was. That's what happened. That's what America had become. The word pride is thrown around an awful lot. Even in the scriptures, it's not looked upon very favorably. But really, think of it this way. When your son or your daughter goes to school and gets that A, or does that recital with that instrument, and you know, and he or she knows they've done really well, they come home with that A, they come home with that report card, you take pride in your son or your daughter, and rightfully so. There was a national pride. A national pride. There once was a time when people would proudly fly their flags. The American experiment never, ever envisioned tribal groups, tribalism, where people would separate themselves within the same land. Groups taking advantage of the United States. If you look around the room, What is it that draws us together? It's our faith. Our faith draws us together. Different colors, different backgrounds. Thankfully, some of us spoke different languages, learned the language, can communicate, but it's our faith that brings us together. We have a common Father. We have a common faith. One Father, one cross, one Spirit, one baptism. It's our faith that brings us together from so many different backgrounds and cultures. The concept of one nation under God, and yet a multiplicity of peoples celebrating God. One nation formed from different cultures, and yet it's the pride that at one point, that American pride used to bring us together. I'm afraid to say that's not the case anymore. Now there are forces at work that are developing a new culture, a different culture. And I wish I could say that the culture that is being formed is for the better, but it is not, it's for the worse. The Center for Immigration Studies writes, quote, 41% of immigrants, 41%, score at or below the lowest level of English literacy, a level variously described as, quote, below basic or functional illiterate, end quote. That is very disturbing. 2 out of 5. 2 out of 5. Not only can they not read English, write English, speak English, they have no desire to. No desire. And folks, that is a travesty. Because it's not about you. And it never has been. It's all about him. It's all about his kingdom which is coming. Now his kingdom's not here yet. When his kingdom is here, all the believers will be able to communicate effectively with one another. David spoke Hebrew. Will we be able to communicate with him? Obviously. How? Have no idea. But that day's not today. How can you move to a country and not be able to share the gospel with the very people that you've moved to? How can you come into a worship service and not be able to speak the language of those that are around you and edify them? I would hope to God, if he ever chose someday to pick up this congregation and drop it, I don't know, Jacques Melhaven, or Port-au-Prince, or Lake Kai, guess what we would all have to do, except for one in the room? You'd have to learn Creole. How can you communicate with the people there? How can you share the gospel with them there? They're lost. They're on their way to hell. You have to learn the language. The believers there are already there, our brothers and sisters. You're going to have to learn Creole. So you can share with them, rejoice with them, edify. Because it's not about you. It's not about me. It's all about him. It's always been about him. And yet there are forces at work that are feverishly working to change the culture so that we're not one nation under God. No, we're tribes, tribalism, just scratching and clawing at each other's throats. And that's what the people want. So in these lessons, this one today, finishing up next week, we're going to learn how they're doing it and for what reason. It is a spirit at work, make no mistake. It is an evil, demonic spirit. It is the spirit of Antichrist, the specter of communism. Writes, quote, mass migration dissolves national identity, borders, sovereignty, cultural traditions, and social cohesion. As masses of people are removed from their traditional identities, they are more easily absorbed into the drift of modernity. It is difficult for immigrants living in an unfamiliar environment to secure their livelihood let alone participate deeply in their host country's political processes or cultural traditions. Newly arrived immigrants are thus easily recruited as free votes for leftist parties and social causes. Meanwhile, immigration creates ripe conditions for stirring up racial and religious animosities, end quote. And that's what America is becoming. It's not one nation under God. And we're all celebrating the Lord. And there's a pride that kind of draws us together as we look at one another regardless of color, and we can say, hey, we're American. No, 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 no. Now we're just tribes, each looking to get their own piece of the pie. And that will destroy us. Michael Clemens is a fellow for the Center for Global Development. He writes, foreign aid focused on economic development is actually associated with increases in immigration from poor countries. Always remember, where there is dependency, there is going to be misery. Where there is dependency, there is misery. You can look at Detroit, Cleveland, Memphis, St. Louis, San Fran, New Orleans. I can go on and look at those that are living in those cities, those that are dependent on the government. There is misery there. There is poverty there. There is crime there. There's drugs there. There's abuse that's going on there. Where there is dependency, there is misery. And so now in Guatemala, the country has lost so many people. Their highest source of income now is the money that Guatemalans make here in the United States and send back to Guatemala. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, acronym AMLO, said back in 2018, believe it or not, even a communist can tell the truth now and then. He says, quote, these remittances are the main income that the country has, more than oil, more than tourism. Imagine that your main source of income is standing out on the street corner with your hands open. That's your main source. Begging. Identity politics. Identity politics relies on the creation of groups and then kind of greasing your palm, giving you incentives to adhere to the groups. Once again, identity politics is the creation of groups and then giving you incentives to adhere to the groups. I've mentioned the name before. He was an Italian and a communist back in the 1930s, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci looked at the writings of Karl Marx and said, you know what? Karl's onto something. He's right. You got to bring division, right? So Karl was right. Bourgeoisie, proletariat, right? So he's onto something. But this is where Karl got it wrong, according to Gramsci. That those in the working class, the proletariat, were aspirational. Meaning, hey, you're working, you're making more money. Maybe you're making more money, right? You got food, you're paying your bills, you get a house, you buy another house, a nicer house. Hey, I don't have to be the bourgeois. I'm fine being a proletariat. And Gramsci noticed that and said, yeah, see, that's the problem. So we're going to have to indoctrinate. He said, campaigns of indoctrination would have to be deepened and expanded to instill resentment. Because it's all about division. If I can bring division in, I can start a revolution. And so for Gramsci, he looked at it and said, we'll take Marx's model, but we're going to focus on something that you can't change. Because you can change your economic status. You can come to this country with the clothes on your back and 50 cents in your pocket and work hard, get another job, take a night class, whatever, find another job. You have the ability here in America to pull yourself out of poverty. And Gramsci knew that. So you can change your economic status. But there's something you can't change, and that's the color of your skin. Or your sex. So that's where we'll point the attention to. That's where we'll bring the division. I may not be able to get you to hate your employer's position. Oh, but what if I can get you to hate the color of your employer's skin? That's where we'll go. Mike Gonzalez, which I'll be quoting from a lot, especially today, wrote a book, The Plot to Change America. He said in the 1940s and 50s, so this didn't just happen, what you're seeing. Watch how that devil lays everything out very slowly. In the 1940s and 50s, Henry Wallace ran for president in 1948, and Edward R. Roybal, who ran for LA City Council in 1949, saw Mexican Americans as a source of political power, but only if the Mexican Americans could be organized around feelings of racial grievances. The Community Services Organization, or CSO, founded by radical Saul Alinsky, galvanized the Mexican Americans to vote for leftist socialist causes. Roybal found his way into the U.S. House of Representatives in 1962 in hopes of implementing racially dividing legislation. In 1976, he sponsored a bill called Public Law 94-311. Gonzalez explains this law was, quote, a remarkable piece of legislation that identifies what a Hispanic is and why this designation has to be created. The law maintains that, quote, a large number of Americans of Spanish origin or descent suffer from racial, social, economic, and political discrimination and are denied the basic opportunities that deserve American citizens, and which should enable them to begin to lift themselves out of poverty they now endure, end quote. So therefore, according to the piece of legislation, what the Hispanics had in common was neither ethnicity or race or language. No. You are victims of discrimination. That's what we're going to focus on. And Gonzalez says, victimization or victimhood was the bonding agent. That's the glue. Now, you may think, once you hear this, like, wow, that guy was a racist. And you're right. And you may say, man, the piece of legislation that he was putting forward, this bill, it's a racist piece of legislation. And you would be right. And yet, in 2014, that did not stop President Barack Obama from giving him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That is the highest honor you can give a civilian. He awarded him for coming up with racist legislation. Gonzalez continues. In 1970, the Ford Foundation, a leftist think tank, funded a study which was provocatively entitled, "The Mexican American People, the nation's second largest minority." But these Mexican Americans never thought of themselves as minorities, just Americans. They never accepted being called minorities, and they didn't have to. The socialist elite community organizers had already done it for them. Mexican Americans were now being told they were oppressed by white supremacists and a racist America, just like African Americans were. Only one problem: they disagreed. A study admitted, quote, prejudice has been a loaded topic of conversation in any Mexican American community. Indeed, merely calling Mexican Americans a minority and implying that the population is the victim of prejudice and discrimination has caused irritation among many who prefer to believe themselves indistinguishable white American. Why are you trying to divide us? There are light-skinned Mexican Americans who have never experienced the faintest discrimination in public facilities, and many with ambiguous surnames have also escaped the experiences of the more conspicuous members of the group. Finally, there's the inescapable fact that even comparatively dark-skinned Mexicans could get service even in the most discriminatory parts of Texas a generation or two ago. Now, as one generation dies and another generation comes in, we all know that. To this day, for the most part, whether you call it Hispanic, whether you call it Latino, whether you call it what have you, to this day, Roman Catholicism is in the culture. In the Latino or Hispanic, whatever you want to call it, Roman Catholicism is in the culture. And to a certain extent, that's a good thing. Because in the culture, they do understand this biblical principle. 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. And they understood that. And so, from that perspective, hey, we don't want handouts. We didn't come here for handouts. Because they understood the scriptures. That was in the culture. So Gonzalez writes, quote, Mexican Americans who always believed that lack of success was an individual's own failure were now being told otherwise. You're a victim. Was racism being felt by some Mexican Americans in the Southwest? Of course. Show me a country on the planet where you don't find racism. Racism will continue to exist until Yeshua comes back, period. Systemic racism, no. No. And the Mexican Americans knew it. A UCLA report admitted the obvious. Mexican Americans will probably increasingly come to view themselves as a minority with rectifiable grievances. Ooh, so it's not the system. Listen, however, they are not easy to merge with the other large minorities in political coalition. So here you have the Ford Foundation, which was actively trying to create an ethnically speaking minority group that had never existed before. One of the writers for this racist piece of research was a man by the name of Julian Samora. Julian Samora, who had a PhD in sociology and anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis, co-founded an ethnic identity organization, the Southwest Council of La Raza, back in 1967. He and a number of socialists were fans of German philosophers during and after World War II. He was of Mexican descent and came up with the idea that if you can take a Mexican living in Southern California and a Cuban living in South Florida, other than speaking Spanish, they have nothing in common. But if you can join their forces and portray them as victims, you can bring about a revolution against the white minority or majority. Samora founded a term which is now famous: Hispanic. So if you ever want to know where that word came from, Julian Samora Jimenez. He came up with it. For no other reason, we need to formulate a group and label them as victims. Because we need them to fight them in the same country. Imagine, Gonzalez says, 100 years ago, they were simply Americans. And the census saw them in the same class as white Americans. Mexican Americans who had always thought they were Americans, just the same as whites, were now being told they were a disadvantaged minority. So again, the devil knows if he can bring division, he can start a revolution. All I need is division. In a marriage, in a home, in a church, in a nation. Just bring the division, and I can start a fight. Jose Angel Gutierrez was a Texas community organizer and a Ford Foundation member. Gonzalez writes, what Gutierrez intended to do in the United States was made abundantly clear in April 1975 when he led a delegation of his Raza Unida party to Cuba at the invitation of communist dictator Fidel Castro. At a news conference after his return, he said that the Cuban Revolution was alleviating the problems of poverty and racism on the island. It's almost like you almost got to laugh at that, right? Would you like to ask the Cubans now if communism is for the better over there? Has communism erased poverty on the island of Cuba? Folks, they're getting into boats and going across shark-infested waters to get here. They want to get away from communism so bad. Mexican Americans' experience in Texas, a reporter said, quote, "You're going to be asked sometime that if you like socialism so much, why don't you and all the other Mexicans go to Cuba?" To which Gutierrez replied, "Because we are going to make Cuba over here." See? Why make Cuba better? No, we're bringing communism here. In 1971, a Texas district court ruled that Mexican Americans constituted, quote, "an identifiable ethnic minority class." So in just 24 years, it took Marxists here in America to form another class of people and bring more division and hatred to our nation. Next, pressure had to be put on the Census Bureau and the 1980 census to place Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, and Puerto Ricans under the ethnic banner of Hispanic American. The Census Bureau complied and created what we have today as identity politics. For the first time, Americans were asked to carve themselves up along ethno-racial lines. Hispanics began rejecting their Hispanic label, many asking, why was this only happening in America? Great question. Even the Mexican Americans are saying, whoa, everywhere we go in the world, we're not told to like separate ourselves from everybody. Why are you only doing it here in America? Because, man, it sure seems like you want to start a fight. They're not so dumb. As of 2015, only 23% of Hispanics actually refer to themselves as Hispanics. Many refer to the country of origin or simply American. Then enter in Spanish language media, Telemundo and Univision, who consistently push the Hispanic narrative. In addition to culturally responsive teaching, which is education taught differently based on race. More division. Whatever you do, don't call yourself an American. Division. It gets darker. Mark Levin writes of Rodolfo Acuna, who was really to Latino victimization like Derek Bell was to critical race theory. And he writes, Acuna's 1972 book, Occupied America, opens, quote, "Mexicans, Chicanos in the United States today are an oppressed people. They are citizens, but their citizenship is second class at best. They are exploited and manipulated by those with more power, and sadly, many believe that the only way to get along in Anglo-America is to become Americanized themselves. Awareness of their history, of their contributions and struggles, of the fact that they were not the treacherous enemy that Anglo-American histories have said they were, can restore pride and a sense of heritage to a people who have been oppressed for so long. In short, awareness can help them to liberate themselves." End quote. They have to liberate themselves. They didn't know they needed to liberate. Acuna goes on, and a number of other Marxists go on. And it gets dark. Because their theory is this, that what you know of as Canada and America, North America, should not be. That actually we should take North America and South America and just make it one continent, America. And that North America, which consists of Canada and the United States, originally belonged to the Latino people, and we're going to give it back to them. We're going to give it back to them. And the white people that are here, you need to go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. This was never your land. Go back to Europe, go back to Western Asia. Levin writes, those crossing the border by the hundreds of thousands, according to these writings, are the actual indigenous Americans. Moreover, the Democratic Party hopes to benefit from embracing the movement, as it counts on wave after wave of illegal aliens and subsequent grants of amnesty as one of the ways in which it seeks a permanent hold on power. As Pew Research has reported, Latino voters favor the Democratic Party by a significant margin. Now, there are some issues that obviously these crazy people are facing. One of them, here's an example of it, which kind of like is a poke in the eye. Ron DeSantis in November of 2022 won his gubernatorial race against Charlie Crist. Okay. Now, there are multiple reasons why. Number one, he's a man of God, and he's a good governor. Secondly, Charlie Crist is pathetic. But here is the real shocker. Of the Tri-County area, Palm Beach County, Broward, Miami-Dade, Ron DeSantis, a white guy, won 2 of those 3 counties. Excuse me? Folks, he won Miami-Dade County. How in the world did Ron DeSantis win Miami-Dade? So we've discussed Latin American immigration. How about Asian American immigration? If you go to Google, and I did recently just to make sure, and you type in the Atlanta shooting, which was March 17, 2021, that was the spa shooting, you'll see page 1, because Google's always going to send you to where they want you to go. You'll see a story there from the New York Times, and they called that shooting a hate crime. In fact, they go on in the article to say that the shooter was a white supremacist. 8 people were shot and killed on that day of March 2021. 8. 2 of them were Asian. Yet it was called a hate crime. Strange. Why? Gonzalez writes, Yuichi Ichioka was a Berkeley graduate student and a radical Marxist. It was Ichioka who coined the term Asian American in 1966. Ichioka founded the Asian American Political Alliance, much like the Black Panthers, which incorporated Maoist thinking and practice. For Ichioka, if Mao could erase China's history during China's revolution in the 1950s, well, then the same thing could be done here in America. But communists have long thought Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, would not submit to critical race theory and identity politics. Interesting that in San Francisco's Chinatown back in the 1960s, the Black Panthers began training Chinese Americans in Marxist ideology and violent activism. Those Chinese Americans soon became known as the Red Guards. Those who refused training were accused of white acceptance. Sound familiar? Yeah. That was back in the 60s. They're doing the same thing today. Nothing has changed. If you don't join up with us, you're white acceptance, white supremacy, white. The Red Guards were encouraged by reading Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon, Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro. Some dressed like the Black Panthers and began talking like them. The objective was simple: bring violent revolution which would destroy U.S. imperialism and capitalism. Ichioka and his radical wife, Emiki, knew the importance of numbers. They also knew that most Far Eastern people in the United States had come after 1965 and had not suffered actual racism as blacks in the South had, or even Mexican Americans had in the Southwest. Now, make no mistake, their parents, on the other hand, what their parents had to go through in America was atrocious. During the 40s, it is a sad situation. You had people that came, either were born here in America, or they left Japan and they had come to America, and the American people here during the 40s treated them like trash, simply because of the war. How they were treated was pathetic. But this was the next generation. They hadn't experienced that. Their Japanese American descendants by 1965 made up 53% of Asian Americans. But here's the problem. Japanese Americans had the highest rate of marriage outside of their natural origin. So the Japanese people would come to America, and it wasn't as if, okay, I need to find another Japanese person to marry. They had no problem marrying anybody. So the most integrated group was, by 1965, the least Asian. Now that's a problem. I mean, if we're going to carve up America, that's a problem. The number needed to be bigger because the Communist Party needed a bigger army. So they formed the Asian American Political Alliance and coined the term Asian Americans. That term caught on from Berkeley, which quickly spread throughout California universities and over to the East Coast, including Columbia and Yale. Now, here's another problem Gutierrez brings up. Asian descent makes up only 6.7% of the population. In addition, Asian Americans are known for academic and financial accomplishment. Their parents trained them at an early age that success came from effort and cultural habits, not government handouts. So one can see how it would be hard to say that they've been oppressed when they haven't. Another problem, according to 2012 Pew Research study, 62% of Asian Americans describe themselves by their country of origin. 19% describe themselves as Asian Americans. 14% is just Americans. To galvanize a race group as oppressed and to build up a revolutionary army to take down supposed white privilege is going to be a tough sell. Yet another problem. The Japanese American average household income is at $80,700, higher than the national average. How? America's racist. You can't make it here. But they're making $80,000 a house. How are they doing that? That's more than the national average in a racist America. Of Chinese Americans, 27% have a bachelor's degree. Ooh, are you starting to see a trend here? Another 27% have at least a graduate degree. Asian people have the second highest marriage rate behind Indian Americans, with Asian women having the lowest divorce rate. Side note, black women divorced at 3 times the rate of Asian women, and white women 2 times the rate. So let's put all the cards out. So this is what's going on. This is what's in the Asian culture. If you go to school, you read more, you study, you get good grades, you go to college, you get a graduate's degree, you get a bachelor's degree, you get a job, get a good paying job, get married, have children, work out your problems, work out your issues, don't get a divorce, you'll succeed. America's racist! Really? That's a hard sell. More numbers. Out of wedlock births, Asian Americans, 11.7%. White women, 28.2%. Hispanic women, 51.8%. Black women, 69.4%. So, is America racist, or do we have a cultural problem? Dropout rates. Asian Americans, 2%. Whites, 4%. Blacks, 6.5%. Hispanics, 10.1%. What are the Asians taught? Go to school, learn, read, get good grades, get married, don't get divorced, work out your problems. Somehow or other, they're succeeding. According to a Fox News report, the author of a new book feels Asian Americans are an inconvenient minority to the liberal media because as their community succeeds based on merit alone, and isn't that what John Quincy Adams said? It's not a nation of privileges, it's a nation of equal rights. They debunk the critical race theory narrative that opportunities of non-whites are limited because of systemic racism in the United States. Quote, Asian Americans prove that critical race theory is not true. Cannot be true, author Kenny Zhu told Fox News. Asian Americans never needed politics to succeed in this country. They just want to be treated based on merit. Zhu's book, An Inconvenient Minority, The Attack on Asian American Excellence and the Fight for Mediocrity, explains how Ivy League universities such as Harvard discriminate against qualified Asian Americans to maintain a particular racial makeup in their student body. He found that race-based admissions processes designed to push diversity at elite institutions crush the narrative being pushed by much of the mainstream media. So you have an entire culture of people who've been taught by their parents, you go to school, you read, you study, you get good grades. You go to college, you get a graduate degree, you get a bachelor's degree. And so they're qualified. They're actually qualified to get into Harvard and Yale and Brown and Princeton. They're qualified, and these colleges are saying, we don't want you. Wrong color. Yep. Sorry. Wrong color. And they're being pushed aside, and they're qualified to go to Harvard and Yale. And Harvard and Yale said, no, not dark enough. Zhu said, if America is still a systemically racist country for minorities, how come they have allowed Asian Americans to overtake whites in education level and socioeconomic status? Asians get higher test scores. End quote. He goes on, I think it's deliberate. The reason why is because Asian Americans are the inconvenient minority. Zhu said, critical race theory really doesn't have any room for Asians. So, we've discussed Latin Americans, we've discussed Asian Americans, Indian Americans. Let's go for them. Because remember, we got to carve up this thing. We got to make as many groups as we can, as many tribes as we can, because we need everybody fighting each other. Identity politics, the creation of groups, and then giving you incentives to adhere to the groups. Gonzalez writes, Indian Americans from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., wanted their piece of the pie. Hey, we're people of color too. What about us? The 1970 census had designated them white, which suddenly the Indian Americans didn't want if they were to get special privileges. Hey, since you're handing out stuff, like you go to the grocery store, they want to give you that little cup of granola, right? Hey, I want to give me. But, get this, they didn't want to be classified as Hispanics or black either. So we want our piece. Just don't call us them. We want our own group. Since everybody's a victim, we want to be victims too. Problem. The Indian American group has the highest educational attainments on average, and they have the highest median household income. The average income in the United States is $57,600. That's the average. The average Indian American household income. Everybody buckled in? You ready? Take a breath. $114,200. America's racist! Can't make it here. $114,000 on average. In addition, 32% of Indian Americans have at least a bachelor's degree, 40% a graduate's degree. If all that's the case, Gonzalez says, then the term white privilege is a farce. How about cultural indicators? High rate of marriage, low rate of divorce, low rate out of wedlock births. You see this pattern? Go to school, study, get good grades, go to college, get a good job, get married, have children, don't get divorced. It's amazing how the same pattern kind of works itself out. So we got the Latin Americans, we carved them up. We've got the Asian Americans, right? That's another group. Indian Americans, right? Because we need as much division as we can get. Got another one for you. The Minas. Minas, got to bring more division. Another victim group was formulated to get into the 2020 census. The Minas, which stands for Middle Eastern North Africa. See how this is working? Gonzalez writes, quote, countries from Morocco to Iran and from Turkey to the Sahara Desert. Many of the MENA group are of Persian descent, who were professionals and who immigrated around the time of the fall of the Shah of Iran back in 1979. In 2005, the Iranian American per capita average incomes were estimated to be 50% higher than the rest of the population. I don't know how they're doing, because America is so racist. How are all these groups making more money than the white people in this systemically racist America? There are 2.5 million persons of Arab or Persian origin in America. During the Obama administration, the President's Task Force and Census Forum participants attempted to do something that had never been done before. You remember? They racialized the religion of Islam. Think about it. I gotta hand it to them. They took a religion and racialized it. So now if you say anything negative about Islam, you're a racist. You're Islamophobe. Thank you, Barack. Nice work. More division, more hatred, more division, more hatred. In closing, Gonzalez humorously says it this way. We have now come to the point in our country, we're so divided, and this has been going on for decades. We're not just, can't have you just Americans. No. We need division. We need tribalism. And so Gonzalez says it this way. We've come to the point in our country, if you throw a brick at a mosque, you're a racist. If you throw a brick at a black church, you're a racist. If you throw a brick at a white church, that's called vandalism. So we're going to pause, and we'll pick up the conclusion next week. Father, we thank you. Thank you for truth. Lord, your design has never changed. The group that came out of Egypt was a diversified group. It wasn't just Hebrews. It was all kinds of people who understood completely that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the true God. And we're all going to wonderfully and joyously worship you together in spirit and in truth. One nation, the children of Israel. Adopted, different kinds of branches. Natural branches, grafted in wild branches. One tree. Lord, our nation was on that trajectory. One nation under God. All created equal, with certain unalienable rights. It's what the founders wanted. Lord, we have studied now, we continue to study how there are evil, wicked people in academia, in the government, who do not want us to be one nation under God. On the contrary, they are working feverishly to have each of us at each other's throats. They don't want us to look past skin color. In fact, they want us to hate people who do not look like us. This is so anti-biblical, Lord. It is not your design. It never has been. But Lord, we thank you that we can see clearly what is happening, how the enemy is clearly at work here. I just pray, Lord, that enough of us would be able to understand and warn others and prepare and not get caught up in this trash. That we would fully understand what your design is for us. You have created us in your own image. We don't all look the same. And it doesn't matter. It's one faith, it's one Lord, It's one cross, it's one empty tomb, it's one Spirit, it's one baptism. I look forward, Lord, look so forward to the day when you will be on the throne here. And all the nations of the earth, all different colors, all different shapes and sizes, will all be your people. All be your people, all raising up your name, all extolling you, all magnifying your holiness. And evil people trying to divide us, they will be no more. Lord, thank you for the truth. Thank you for having patience with us. We ask for boldness in these things. We ask all of these things, of course, in your Son's name, Yeshua. Amen.